Since around 2015, the sciences have been engulfed in a crisis called the reproducibility crisis or the replicability crisis. It's become apparent that the majority of scientific papers in top scientific journals, peer-reviewed scientific journals, have results that are not reproducible. This has been a dramatic and shocking finding for many scientists. It's caused a lot of soul-searching. There's been a mood of humility in the sciences that I've never seen before as a result of this. And scientific journals like Nature have had endless discussions about the reasons for the reproducibility crisis. I'm going to be discussing some of those reasons in this talk, particularly the influence of experimenters' expectations and intentions on the outcome of experiments. I'm going to suggest that these involve obvious kinds of bias like selective attention, but they could also involve more subtle influences, unconscious influences of the experimenter on the system they're working on, perhaps even involving mind over matter effects. But there are many more obvious and simple and straightforward reasons for the reproducibility crisis, which I'll be examining first. This crisis is really a mainstream concern within the sciences, and this cartoon in Nature in 2015 actually portrays the temple of science crumbling as a result of this crisis. The temple says across the top, robust science, and as you see, this cartoon shows it falling apart. And that is something that really does seem to reflect the mood within the sciences. Well, what are the reasons for this? One reason is, ironically, the belief that many scientists have that they're uniquely objective. The sciences have been founded on a kind of ideology of objectivity. There's been an assumption that in every other sphere of human activity, people are fallible. They can easily deceive themselves. A lot of critics of religion have pointed out that there is a self-deception involved and illusions might be involved. In art and literature, there's always a variation of opinion and subjective valuations. In people's assessment of other people, there are large subjective elements. But it's been assumed that science is somehow uniquely objective. And this was built into the ideology of science right from the very beginning of the modern phase of mechanistic science, starting in the 17th century. Johannes Kepler, one of the founders of modern science, wrote a book in 1609 called The Somnium Sive Astronomia Lunaris, the dream or the astronomy of the moon. And in it, he portrays somebody travelling up to the moon, helped by a witch who was able to travel, according to popular folklore, flying in the night on a broomstick or a goat. And the witch was supposed to have helped the narrator of the book travel during a lunar eclipse so he didn't get burned by the sunlight up to the moon. This device was obviously a literary device, but it did reflect some of the background to this disembodied knowledge of scientists, which is shamanic journeying, because shamans are often believed to travel out of the body and to be able to visit and see things from different points of view, from their normal point of view. Anyway, Kepler's intention here was to illustrate what the Earth looked like when seen from the moon. Ever since the time of ancient Greece, people had imagined the Earth as a sphere seen from outside. They'd been making globes for centuries. So the idea of an imaginative view of the Earth seen from outside was already there. But the new feature of Kepler's account was to see the Earth spinning from the moon. And that was to do with the Copernican system of astronomy where the Earth rotates. Previously, people had not thought the Earth rotated. They did think it was a sphere, but they didn't think it rotated. This was really a literary device to try and demonstrate that science was about a point of view that's not confined to our bodies and to the Earth. The philosopher René Descartes, who did so much to establish science as we now know it, made it very clear that he thought the mind of the scientist, or the minds in general, and intellects in general, were disembodied, essentially. And this is what he wrote in his Meditations of 1641. He starts off with the famous cogito ergo sum, I am thinking, therefore I exist. And then he immediately inferred that his thinking mind was disembodied. From this, I knew I was a substance whose whole essence or nature is simply to think, and which does not require any place or depend on any material thing in order to exist. Accordingly, this I, that is, the soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and indeed is easier to know than the body, and would not fail to be whatever it is, even if the body did not exist. So this gave the basis for scientific knowledge as a kind of disembodied knowledge, a view from nowhere, that was somehow rising above all the normal limitations of humans, all the normal limitations of subjectivity and fallibility of judgment. And this ideal really got built into the mythology of science. And I think this helps to explain why Stephen Hawking achieved such an iconic status in science, because as a result of his terrible illness, he was as close to a disembodied mind as a human could possibly be. And this was an essential part of his public image. His best-selling book, A Brief History of Time, that came out in 1988, had a quote from Time magazine on the back cover. And what Time magazine said was, "Even as he sits helplessly in his wheelchair, his mind seems to soar ever more brilliantly across the vastness of space and time to unlock the secrets of the universe." Well, this idea of disembodied knowledge was also reflected in a style of writing in science which came into fashion in the 19th century, when scientists tried to establish themselves as a professional group, basically a kind of new priesthood of the new progressive world order. And they started writing in a highly artificial style, using the passive voice. Instead of saying, "I took a test tube," they said, "A test tube was taken," as if somehow all the procedures in the laboratory unfolded in front of the scientist like a kind of passive observer. And instead of saying, "I think," when discussing the results, they use phrases like, "it is considered that." So this peculiar artificial style is still going on. I became aware of how predominant it still is when my older son Merlin was aged 11, and at school he was told to write his science reports like this. When he was younger, he'd written the most lively science reports, fresh and observant. And I was appalled when, at age 11, he'd gone to secondary school, and his science report was talking about some experiment, smelling something in a test tube. It says, "The test tube was heated and carefully smelled." And he explained to me that this was a style sheet he was copying that his science teacher had given him. And the science students were all required to write their reports in this highly artificial style, as if they were observing something that was just happening in front of them, passively observing instead of actually doing the experiments. I myself gave up using the passive style in science reports even when I was an undergraduate, and for decades most scientists I know have not used this style. But it's still being taught in schools. I did a survey in 1999 of 172 secondary schools in England, no, throughout Britain, in Scotland and Wales as well. And what I wrote to the heads of science in these schools and asked them what they did about teaching students to write science reports. It turned out that 42% of the schools were requiring the students to write their reports in the passive voice, 45% used the active voice, and 13% had no preference. Of those who were using the passive voice, the teachers were teaching it because they thought this was required by scientific authorities or by school examination boards. I asked the school examination boards for Britain, and they all said that they had no requirement for the passive voice. They accept reports in either the active or the passive voice. And I also did a survey of journals. Long ago, in the 60s and 70s, Nature and other leading scientific journals started editing reports into the active voice. And I did a survey of 55 leading journals. Out of the 55, only 2 required reports to be in the passive voice. The sciences themselves have moved on, but many people's image of science is still based on this passive voice, this illusion of objectivity that it conveys. I asked Lord May, who was then the President of the Royal Society here in Britain, what he thought about the use of the passive voice. And he made a very forthright statement about it, which is, I shall quote now. He said, "I would put my own view so strongly as to say that these days the use of the passive voice in a research paper is the hallmark of second-rate work." And he went on, "In the long run, more authority is conferred by the direct approach than by the pedantic pretense that some impersonal force is performing the research." Well, many scientists have now moved on, but the pretense that science is uniquely objective, built into the culture of science, and actually made part of its style through the use of the passive voice, has meant that many scientists have not really questioned the objectivity of science. The illusion that they're uniquely objective is part of scientific culture, or at least it was until recently. And the usual view is that this objectivity was supported by the twin pillars of peer review and replication. The idea is that all scientific papers are vetted for quality by peer review, anonymous usually, by peer reviewers who are people in the same field who evaluate the worthiness of the papers for publication, point out flaws and faults and so on, and replicability, that scientific reports could all be replicated and were therefore reliable in a way that other kinds of human endeavour were not. But the reproducibility crisis focused attention on the causes of this lack of replication, and what it revealed was that there are many reasons why papers are not reproducible. First of all, it focused attention on the policy of scientific journals themselves, which is where the papers are ultimately published. They play a large role in this crisis, it turns out. First of all, the journals have to promote themselves. Their prestige depends on how often the papers in them get citations, and they're all measured by citation indexes. So there's a constant pressure on journals to make their papers more high profile. They seek for high profile results that will capture headlines in newspapers if possible, and they want positive results. Scientific journals need to have a high profile. They want positive results that make an impact. That means there's no incentive for scientists to publish muddled results, confused results, negative results. And scientists themselves need papers in scientific journals to advance their career. To get ahead as a scientist, the primary criterion of success is publication in high prestige journals with a high citation index, which means the papers are quoted by other papers. So it's within a bubble of scientific literature that all this is happening. So scientists need high prestige journals need high prestige scientists, and prestige depends on publication in these journals. Many of these journals won't publish papers that are replications of other research because they say it's not original. So there's a built-in publication bias from journal policies. They want positive results that make bold and seemingly important claims. They don't want replications because they're not original. They don't want negative results because they're not very interesting or exciting, or ambiguous results. The result is that scientists publish their best results. They publish results that look convincing, that seem important, and they select the data they publish. They only publish a small proportion of their actual data. So clearly there's going to be a bias in what they present. If you only had to present 10% of your accounts to the income tax authorities, you could obviously make them look as favourable as possible for your tax situation and pay as little tax as possible. And many scientists publish 10% or less of their actual results, so there's obviously a built-in bias here. There's also a bias in the way that scientists record their results. A famous example comes from Robert Millikan, who got the Nobel Prize for his work on the charge on the electron, which he worked out by looking at the way oil droplets were charged and how the charge of the electron affected the behavior of these droplets. It was the standard method at the time, not a very precise method. But he had a rival in an Austrian scientist called Ehrenfeld, who was saying that the results were not very clear. It wasn't clear that there was a single unitary charge on the electron. And Millikan won this dispute with Ehrenfeld by publishing a paper showing amazingly precise results, and he got the Nobel Prize. Well, when a historian of science looked at his lab notebooks many years later, he found that the reality was very different. Robert Millikan's notebook, when he was discussing individual measurements of these oil drops, had remarks beside each measurement. One of them said, "Very low, something wrong." And so, of course, he didn't publish that one. And there was another one that gave just the result he wanted. It said, "Beauty, publish this." So clearly there's selective bias going on right there in the recording of data. This is one of the things that's happening in labs all the time. And then there's this publication bias where only a small proportion of the data get published. For many years, so-called skeptics have been attacking parapsychologists by saying that if they get positive results in experiments on telepathy or other psychic phenomena, these positive results must be produced by what they call the file drawer effect, that parapsychologists, they say, publish only positive results and don't publish negative results, therefore biasing the whole literature. Well, parapsychologists have been subject to so much skeptical scrutiny for decades that they've responded by making parapsychology ever more rigorous. And I think it's now the case that parapsychology is probably the most rigorous of all the sciences. Years ago, parapsychologists realized that the file drawer effect could indeed bias results, so parapsychology and psychic research journals have made a point of publishing negative results, and parapsychologists of publishing all their results, not just selected results that show what they want them to show. They've published all their results. The result is that in parapsychology and psychic research journals there are quite a lot of papers with negative results. then the skeptics say, well, look, these effects aren't reproducible, there's nothing in it. So they can't win in the face of this intractable skepticism or negativity. However, it turns out that some parapsychological tests, like the Ganzfeld telepathy test, have been widely reproduced over many years in many different labs. So parapsychology also pioneered the process of pre-registration, where people register in advance what experiments they're going to do and what data they're going to collect. This is in a public repository, so that it's possible to check up what data people are likely to have, what they intended to collect, and to compare this with what they actually report after they've done the experiment. Pre-registration, pioneered by parapsychologists, is now becoming a widespread technique in other branches of the sciences, because it's now widely recognized that the so-called file drawer effect, publishing only favorable or positive data, is extremely widespread in all the sciences except parapsychology, where precautions have been taken against it for a very long time. Now, this certainly applies to medical research. Again, skeptics are like to point out that regular medicine is evidence-based, and it's based on reports in peer-reviewed journals, and therefore it's scientific. But it turns out that when you look at what drug companies do, they publish positive outcomes when their new drugs have been tested, showing that they work. But they don't publish, on the whole, negative outcomes, ones that show they don't work. So if you then do a survey of the published scientific literature in high prestige peer-reviewed journals, then you get a positive result, an evidence-based positive result for the effectiveness of these drugs. But if you actually look, as people have done using Freedom of Information Acts, and looked at the actual unpublished data from these pharmaceutical drug trials, it turns out that in many cases the drug really is no better than a placebo. This is discussed in detail by Ben Goldacre in his book Bad Pharma. And if you're interested in this, and as a critical examination of what's happening in so-called evidence-based scientific medicine, it's well worth looking at his book, because it's very shocking, in fact, how the apparent objectivity of results has been severely distorted. And the scientific journals that report pharmaceutical research turn out to be extremely indebted to pharmaceutical companies, at the very least because they're their main source of advertising revenue. So there's a systematic bias being built into that area of the scientific literature, and because it's so important, it's been critically examined by people like Goldacre more than most other areas of science. When the drug company Bayer was doing research around 2010, many of their research scientists found that they couldn't get very good results trying to follow published papers in cell biology and in molecular biology. And they tried reproducing some of these experiments, and they found they couldn't reproduce them. And the American drug company Amgen carried out a systematic test, which was published in 2012, where they asked their researchers to identify around 50 of the most important papers in scientific journals on which they were basing their research. They did this because the researchers weren't getting very far. They were spending a lot of money, spending a lot of time, and yet not coming up with new products, new drugs. And the researchers were frustrated because they said that a lot of these promising lines of inquiry in these scientific journal papers simply couldn't be reproduced. They commissioned an independent replication of 53 of the top papers, and they found that only 6 out of 53, 11%, were reproducible. 89% were not. Since then, studies have been done in various other branches of science, psychology, social sciences, chemistry, and other areas to see how well the top papers can be reproduced. And it turns out the majority simply can't. In psychology, it's about 60% that can't be reproduced. So this is really, although the drug companies are guilty of terrible bias in the way they report results and distort the scientific literature, it was actually, ironically, drug companies that revealed the extent of the reproducibility crisis. It was really those studies by Bayer and Amgen that led to the awareness of how widespread this is within the sciences. As well as the publication bias that affects scientific results, there's also experimenter effects, where experimenters actually get the results they expect, not through conscious cheating and fraud, although some scientists are guilty of that, and there have been several high-profile cases, Mark Hauser at Harvard, for example, who made up results of studies with monkeys. All of these frauds that have recently been exposed were exposed not by the peer review process, their papers passed the peer review process, but by whistleblowers in their laboratories. So there's certainly a certain amount of fraud, but there's also unconscious experimenter effects. These were highlighted decades ago by Robert Rosenthal and his colleagues at Harvard, who showed that people's expectations very much influenced what they observed. In one test they did with primary school teachers, they told them that they were going to test the entire class at the beginning of the school year to find out those students who were likely to bloom during the school year, and they gave them a test which they called the Harvard Inflected Attitudes Test. It was in fact nothing but an ordinary intelligence test, and then they randomly selected 20% of the students, gave the students the list of the 20% of the students predicted by this test to be bloomers during the year, and at the end of the year it turned out those 20% of the students had performed much better than the others, very significantly better. The teachers' expectations had actually influenced the outcome of the educational process. Now, nowadays you probably wouldn't be able to carry out experiments like that which involved deception of the teachers. They also did another deceptive experiment using Rorschach ink blot tests used by psychologists to reveal people's unconscious mental patterns. And they show, in these tests, they show ink blots and ask people to see if they can see figures in it or pictures or whatever. And these measures the kind of projections people are making. With psychology students, they told half the students that experienced testers and high-quality psychologists tended to find more animals in the ink blot test when testing their patients. And they told the other half that serious testers who were good at testing people had patients who saw more humans. And sure enough, the ones who expected for their patients to see more animals had significantly more animals than the others who had significantly more people. So this biased the outcome of these tests by affecting the experimenters' expectations. They also did experiments with students testing rats in mazes. They had a breed of white rats and they divided them at random into two groups, and they told the students that one group had been selectively bred for being maze bright over many generations, and the other half had been bred for being maze dull. So one half of these rats were intelligent, the other was stupid, and they asked them to test them in mazes, and sure enough, the students found that the maze bright rats did much better than the maze dull rats, exactly as they expected. But as I said, these rats were randomly selected in the first place, so this was a clear effect of the experimenters' expectations. Within medical research and psychology research, the importance of experimenter effects is widely acknowledged. which is why people use blind methodologies. In a blind method, you don't know which sample you're working on. And the best known example of blind methods are in double-blind clinical trials of new drugs. In a double-blind trial, neither the doctors running the trial nor the patients know which pill they're getting is which. Typically, half the patients would randomly be assigned to a blank pill, a placebo pill, which has no therapeutic value, and the others would get the drug being tested. And the double-blind method means that no one involved knows who's getting what. And these trials very often show a large placebo effect. In other words, the blank pill works often as well as the real pill, or sometimes not quite as well, but definitely has some effect. And not only in curing them, but also in producing the same side effects. If the real medicine produces nausea and headaches as side effects, a lot of patients given the placebo have nausea and headaches. Now, if you do it single-blind, where the patients don't know but the doctors do know, you get a smaller placebo effect. And if you do it with no blind conditions, so the patients and the doctors know who's getting the blank pill and who's getting the real drug, the placebo effect goes to a very low level. In other words, people's expectation affects the outcome. The doctor's expectation affects it, and the patient's expectation. And in the double-blind trial, they think some of them think the blank pill is the real pill. They can't tell which is which. So the expectation it's going to work is quite high for doctors and patients, which is what produces the placebo effect. So the placebo effect is probably the best documented of all experimental effects. It's in itself very interesting, but that's not the main theme of what I'm talking about at the moment. So, but the point I'm trying to make is that blind methods help to protect scientists against various forms of bias in recording and observing the results. So how widely are they used? My research assistant, Jane Turney, carried out a survey for me by ringing up the heads of department in 12 British universities, including Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh and Imperial College London. And she rang up physics departments, chemistry departments and a range of biology departments and asked them whether they used and taught about blind methods in their department. Only 1 out of 23 physics and chemistry departments said they taught and used blind methodologies, and only 12 out of 42 biological departments, that's 29%, said they used blind methodologies, and when they did use them, they used them only occasionally. I did a survey of the scientific literature looking at the top journals in a range of fields to see how many of them used blind methods. And the results are shown here. In my 1999 survey, in the physical sciences, 0% were blind. Biological sciences, 0.8%. Animal behaviour, 2.8%. Psychology, where the importance of blind methods is widely recognised, 7%. Medical sciences, 24.2%. And parapsychology, 85.2%. Parapsychologists, again, are by far the most rigorous because they've been subject to so much sceptical scrutiny for so long. This survey was repeated using a different set of journals by Watt and Nachtigal in 2004. They found slightly higher percentage than I did. Things may have changed, or it may just have been a different selection of journals. But even so, in the physical sciences it was 0.5%, in the biological sciences 2.4%, tiny minority using blind methods. Even in psychology it was 22.5%, less than a quarter, and in medicine 36.8%. Only about a third of papers in medicine used blind methodologies. Again, in parapsychology they found 79.1%, nearly 80%, using blind methods. So the majority of science is unprotected against experimenter biases and experimenter effects. This is partly because, as we found in the survey of top universities in Britain, people in the physical and biological sciences think that experimenter effects only occur with human subjects. One chemist said, for example, nature itself is blind, and then said chemistry is hard enough as it is without making it even harder by not knowing what you're working on. So their assumption is that these are completely unnecessary in the physical sciences, and that's why they don't do them. However, there could be really quite strong biases within the physical sciences, and nobody has really systematically investigated how great these effects would be. I put forward an idea in 1998 of how to test for experimental effects in regular science classes in universities. And I thought of this because for years I taught in lab classes in Cambridge, and also at Harvard, where I taught in lab classes for Biology 101. And if you demonstrate in laboratory classes where students are doing experiments, there are always some students who don't get the right result. And when that happens, you just assume they're incompetent or they've made a mistake. You don't say, we're going to change the foundations of science because these simple experiments are not replicable. In fact, science education selects for students who can get the right results. They're the ones who get high grades and pass exams. So almost any experimental scientist who's got a PhD has gone through years of training in getting the expected results in non-blind experiments. So my idea is simple. In a laboratory class where, say, students are comparing an activated enzyme with a control enzyme, half the class at random are given they do it the normal way. They're told, here's the activated enzyme, here's the control enzyme. The other half of the class do it blind. They're given the two samples labelled A and B. And at the end of the experiment, one simply analyses the results to see whether there's any difference between the blind and the open conditions. Now, this could be applied in many different branches of science, and it may be that some would show much larger experimental effects than others. It would be a very good quantitative way of looking at this phenomenon. I tried to get scientists I knew in universities to do this experiment with lab classes. Not one of them would do it. They just weren't interested. I then published this idea in the Skeptical Inquirer, which is published by the main skeptical organization in the US, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. They mostly exert their skepticism on parapsychological or alternative medical themes. They ignore the rest of science, assume that that's fine the way it is. But I suggested that it would be worth checking up on the objectivity of regular science by doing this simple experiment. Not a single skeptic responded with any interest in doing this. And later, Richard Wiseman himself, a skeptic, together with Caroline Watt from Edinburgh University, wrote another article in Skeptical Inquirer appealing for people to do this research. Again, they had no response at all. I did finally find one science teacher who was prepared to do it. He was the physics teacher in one of our leading independent schools here in Britain. And he was going to do it with his physics class. And everything was all set. We discussed the details. And then he rang me up and said, well, Rupert, I can't just do this. We've got to have a meeting with the head of science in the school first. So I went to a meeting with the head of science and all the science teachers and explained why I thought this was an important thing to do. But the head of science, who was a chemist, was very clear this wasn't going to happen. He said to me, of course students are going to get the results they expect. That's what science education is all about, training people to get the expected results. He said, so obviously this experiment's going to show some effect. And he said, and when it does, it's going to open a can of worms, and I don't want that can of worms opened in my school. So he was very clear. He didn't doubt that there would be experimental effects. He just didn't want to have this whole issue opened up. Still, as far as I know, no one has yet done this simple experiment to quantify experimental effects. I think it would be well worth doing, because one could map over the whole of the different the sciences which areas are most prone to them, which are least prone to them, and take precautions accordingly. Obviously, some experimental effects work through selective observation and recording, and selective attention, and paying selective care, taking selective care of things where you expect positive effects compared with ones you expect negative effects. But there's also a more radical possibility, which is that the experimenter's mind might directly, through mind over matter or psychokinetic effects, be affecting the experimental system. Parapsychologists have shown that indeterminate processes like quantum randomness can sometimes be influenced by people's intention. This discovery was first made by Helmut Schmidt in the United States, who showed that people could bias the outcome of randomizing devices if he asked them to make more things happen than chance, they could bias them in one direction. If he asked them to make less than chance, they could bias them in the opposite direction. This research was taken up in Princeton University at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Unit, who did many experiments showing this kind of mental effect on biasing otherwise indeterminate events. So the key thing was intention. Could people's intention affect what happened? Is this possible in science labs? Well, actually, it's well known that this can happen. The negative effects of people on science experiments are the subject of a lot of scientific folklore. This is sometimes called the Pauli effect, after Wolfgang Pauli, or Pauli, who was notorious at influencing experiments negatively. Several heads of laboratory banned him from going into their labs because he upset the experiments. For example, Otto Stern at Hamburg, a physicist at Hamburg, who was a friend of Pauli's, just wouldn't let him in his lab because things would just go wrong. He was regarded as a jinx, someone who could have a negative effect. And Pauli himself was worried about this. He took this quite seriously, and he felt really bad when there was a fire in the cyclotron at Princeton University when he was visiting the department, and he himself thought that he could have been responsible for it by this mysterious negative effect he had as a jinx on experiments. Conversely, some people have positive effects on what's happening. I was once giving a workshop in Canada, and slightly to my surprise, one of the participants was a professor of biochemistry at a leading American university. And he told me that he was a very successful protein chemist, and that one reason he was so successful is that he could get his protein molecules to separate in a separation system where they put on a column and they move through at different rates. And he could get his protein molecule separation systems to work better than his colleagues, got better results, published better papers, and was very successful in his field. So I said, well, what do you think is the secret of your success? Is it simply that you're more technically skillful? He said, well, I'm sure that's got something to do with it. But he said, whenever I'm running one of these columns, he said, I sit in the cold room with it, and as the column's running, I encourage the molecules to separate. He said, I keep saying, separate, separate, separate. And by willpower, he thought he was actually causing these proteins to separate better than if he hadn't done this. I asked him if he'd ever told any of his colleagues about this, and he said, of course not. And in fact, he only told me in confidence, that's why I can't reveal his name, in private. But he was convinced that this was part of his success. There may be countless scientists who are getting unusually good results, who are deliberately putting their intention into their experiments to get good results and getting them. I suggested to him he could actually do an experiment to test for this apparent psychokinetic or mind over matter effect. For example, by getting a technician to prepare two identical columns, put on the sample in the same way, then to select one of them at random by the toss of a coin, and he would sit in a cold room telling that one to separate, while the other one would be put in a similar cold room without him, and then the results were compared, had he managed to affect the results as he thought he was doing. Well, he was very intrigued by this possibility, but he didn't do the experiment, and he told me he simply couldn't do it because it would ruin his career if it was found out that he'd been doing this. It would again open a can of worms. He just preferred to go on doing his work in the usual way without bringing to consciousness or a scientific inquiry what might be happening. Now you see, this principle is completely suppressed within the scientific world. The idea that people could be influencing their experiments through their intention is simply not allowable as a thought. There's a complete denial within official science of the possibility of psychokinesis or psychic phenomena. There's a belief that these things are impossible, that they're certainly irrelevant to science. And this means scientists are exceptionally prone to self-deception, and particularly prone to this kind of effect because they're simply unaware, or they suppress the possibility that this might be happening. Think of the Large Hadron Collider. There's hundreds of physicists who wanted to discover the Higgs boson. They'd had 10 billion euros as a grant to build the collider and do all these experiments. The effects they're looking for are small perturbations in highly random quantum systems. They're all wanting to find this evanescent particle. And sure enough, after running the thing long enough, this signal turns up. They've found the Higgs boson. But have they found the Higgs boson, or have they created it? Is this something they've actually produced psychokinetically? Then they can reproduce it because they expect it to reproduce. But is the reproducibility of this phenomenon simply that their expectations are becoming stronger and more firmly fixed, more habitual? Who knows? You can see this really would open up a can of worms. But I think such effects could be going on within the sciences quite routinely. And my point here, in conclusion, is that the supposed objectivity of science, which is an assumption that meant scientists were exceptionally unaware of the sources of bias within their own activities, which suppressed inquiry into these forms of bias, and resulting in the reproducibility crisis, really require scientific attention to put science itself on a more scientific footing. There needs to be attention to the forms of bias in publication, the forms of bias involved in experimental effects, the use of blind methodologies and the quantification of how important they are in different branches of science. And finally, the opening up of this question of possible mind over matter effects. It could be that the sciences, which are dealing with indeterminate systems of uncertain outcomes with strongly motivated experimenters, may be one of the areas why psychokinesis is happening to the greatest extent in the place where it's least expected. And these, of course, would be very radical, the implications of such findings. But I think unless we look at the basis of the scientific method scientifically, science will not be very scientific and will be subject to all sorts of disturbances and distortions which have been revealed through the reproducibility crisis.